Hello guys, Omni here. I want to give a little bit of an update and kind of a breakdown on why I think the negotiations between Sony and Disney were kind of doomed to fail. A lot of people don't necessarily know who to blame or are putting the blame in the wrong places. Now, neither of these studios, I think, in this situation are blame free by any means. But I do think the majority of fault here is with Disney. And I'm going to kind of break down why, from a business standpoint, it would have been ludicrous and probably devastating to Sony Pictures to accept their deal. And one of the things that's not being reported that much or being considered by a lot of the people talking about this online, on YouTube, on Twitter, or anything like that, is like, well, Sony just walked away from it outright. It's been reported they didn't. They came back to the table with a counteroffer. Now, most people would have assumed that Disney's 50-50 co-financing request at the opening of that was a little ridiculous, and that it's you go into a negotiation a little bit higher than what you want so that you can negotiate down to a reasonable aspect of where you're able to settle and come to an agreement. Okay, right? That's what a lot of people thought when this was initially being reported. Disney came to the table with the 50-50 co-financing demands. Sony walked away from that, and that was the end of most of the reports, and a lot of people are still kind of hanging on that. However, it's been reported Sony came back to the table with what is arguably being discussed as a 70-30 split stake in the Spider-Man universe. And Disney declined that. That is the sweetest deal for both of these companies, and Disney said no. Disney walked away from that. They stuck their heels in at the 50-50 co-financing demands that they opened up with. And Sony's been the only company between the two of these directly involved in this to actually break public silence on the whole situation with their tweets, which I'll go ahead and cover right now. They opened up in a tweet yesterday about this news, and this is how it starts. Much of today's news about Spider-Man has mischaracterized recent discussions about Kevin Feige's involvement in the franchise. We are disappointed, but respect Disney's decision to not have him continue as lead producer on our next live-action Spider-Man film. We hope this might change in the future, but understand that the many new responsibilities that Disney has given him, including all of their newly added Marvel properties, do not allow time for him to work on IP they do not own. Kevin is terrific. We are grateful for his help and guidance and appreciate the path he has helped put us on, which we will continue. Now, that is definitely a perfect PR statement, and it reaffirms a lot of the things that we know, a lot of the things that are coming out about this, that Disney did, in fact, decline and make this decision, and that they're not completely at fault for wanting more money. For them to deny a 30-70 split, I think, is completely ridiculous, and especially for how beneficial and integral they've made Spider-Man to the MCU, and how uncertain the future is for the MCU, and how much people are going to stay invested, no matter how many films or shows they plot out in advance. After Endgame, there is a waning interest. It is apparent, and a lot of people, and not everyone, there's plenty of people that are going to keep on following the franchise wholeheartedly. Myself and a lot of other people that I know have talked to are reporting on the internet, on YouTube, on various news outlets, are very much on the fence about the future of the MCU post Endgame. And I think that's going to be further, this whole turn of events here is going to put a lot of pressure on the MCU, even more so than they already have. So I think, honestly, Sony's got nothing to lose at this point. They have everything to gain by declining this deal. They get full creative access to Spider-Man again. The Venom, financially, is their most profitable movie. Even though Spider-Man broke $1 billion box office worldwide, Sony made more money on Venom. Because they owned that movie 100%, they got to keep a bigger cut of that movie. And that's something the MCU doesn't have access to. That's not something that Marvel had a hand in. Now, you could argue that Venom may not have been as big as it was if it wasn't for MCU and their involvement with Spider-Man. Very fair. Spider-Man and the public reception of such was not that great after Amazing Spider-Man 2, which is really what kind of instigated Sony to make this initial deal with Disney. Now, Disney's current deal that they had in place with them was only a 5% first dollar gross deal. What that means is they only get 5% of the first day's gross of ticket sales. Before Sony gets to turn a profit, that money first goes to Disney. Everything after that then goes to Sony, which is a very small fraction of a cost, but Sony doesn't make anything off of Spider-Man and his involvement in Endgame, Civil War, and Infinity War. Spider-Man, because of their deal, gets to be in those properties, but they don't receive any kind of compensation for that. There's the argument that makes that's free advertising, that's positive press for their franchise by having him be involved in it. But with Kevin Feige, like they said in their tweet, having all these additional responsibilities, it's completely understandable that they pay him more if he's going to be working on projects that are not under his own umbrella, like the Sony film or the Sony Spider-Man films. Where this becomes ridiculous, like I was saying, Spider-Man is Sony's only real money-making franchise left. Before that, there was Bond, but that has reverted to MGM last I saw reported. They don't actually have the licensing rights for that anymore, leaving Spider-Man as their only money-making franchise. So losing that a big stake in that, as well as creative control, because it's not just the finances that Disney wanted. They wanted a 50-50 co-financial stake in everything Spider-Man related. This is not just Tom Holland's Spider-Man. They wanted the entire Spider-Verse. They wanted Venom. They wanted the 900 plus Spider-Man characters that Sony has the licenses for. And this takes pretty much all creative control away from Sony to where everything has to be bounced off and approved by both parties for them to move forward. And Sony's invested so much money, a 9-figure deal for a live action franchise, live action TV series universe, helmed by Lord and Miller, who were the people producing or executive producing Into the Spider-Verse, which won an Oscar and turned a profit. And on top of Venom, which is not MCU related, and it is, like I said, their highest profiting film to date. And if they took this deal, they wouldn't be able to continue forward with any of those projects, at least in the current state of things. They would also be losing half of the profits of all of their other side projects. And currently, even though they would be spending less money marketing them, producing them, and all of that, in the end, they would be losing a lot of money on this deal, no matter how you look at it. Disney would be getting a gigantic pay raise, putting them at equal partners with Sony, while also kind of detracting Sony down to like barely scraping by on things. They'd only be somewhat clearing the budgetary problems on this. So I just kind of want to give an example. So we're going to use Spider-Man Far From Home since that's the most recent one. It had a production budget of $160 million and marketing budget of a record-setting $288 million. The $1.1 billion box office intake. Currently with the 5% Disney deal, Disney got at maximum $55 million. Sony, their profit from the $1.1 billion, they only made a profit margin of $606 million. So a little over half of the total box office gross did Sony get to keep. Now, as an example of that, if this film was produced under the Disney proposed deal, the Sony profit would have been cut to $442 million, which is less than their total which is almost $200 million less than a completely Disney-free Venom movie. That is less than once a little more than what they turned around on Amazing Spider-Man 2. But Amazing Spider-Man, Spider-Man 3, Spider-Man 2, and the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, that is lower than any of those films made, and that's not adjusting for inflation. Those films arguably would have made more, and they were all Sony pure produced. Again, then, and not even only on that. Now, this is another thing to understand, that when Marvel was going bankrupt and all these different companies were buying up their licensing rights, Marvel proper got to keep all of the merchandising rights, which now Disney owns. So no matter what, in the background, outside of the films, Disney's making $1.3 billion a year from Spider-Man, the universe, from anything Spider-Man related. That includes Venom toys, that includes Spider-Verse toys, that includes some comic book sales, theme park sales, all of that. As of 2015, they've been making $1.3 billion off of the Spider-Man brand alone, and Sony doesn't see a single cut of that. Now, that is because Disney was lucky enough to pick up Marvel proper, who maintained those rights, and on top of that, they're wanting 50% control of Sony's stakes in the Spider-Man film rights. That is borderline extortion. That is threatening to the studio as a whole. And, you know, at that point, you should just buy Sony. I don't know if they legally can right now, since they just made this huge purchase of Fox. I think there's a limitation on when they could make another purchase of that size. I'm not too sure on the legality issues behind that. At this point, I don't know why they just don't buy them out. But then then that still doesn't look good on Disney, because they're not Fox has been purchasing Fox is losing money for Disney right now. They lost so much money on that purchase currently, that they've been very upset with that investment, and very public about how upset they have been with their investment in Fox and what they've obtained. So they've closed down, let go people. It's been, they've consolidated, got rid of a lot of the internal departments of that studio of Fox Studios, closed down a lot of their subsidiaries. And we would likely see the same thing with Sony Pictures if they were to buy that from Sony. Sony, as a company, pretty much relies on their camera department, their gaming department, and their filming department for a lot of their revenue. So they've got a very protective interest in Spider-Man because it's their biggest source of revenue. It's their biggest source of sustaining these jobs, sustaining their business. And taking a 50% cut in all of that drastically reduces the amount of money they can actually turn on these movies. Like a movie like Venom, where they turned a profit of $681 million, they would get less. They would get barely over 300. And it's just, I don't know why Disney just outright declined their 70-30 proposal. I think these two companies have everything to benefit from working together and coming to some kind of agreement. Disney needs to settle for less than what they're asking for. That's just the reality of it. They're asking for way more than Sony can provide, and honestly, even if they kept making another Amazing Spider-Man 2, they've got a lot of positive success with Venom, so Venom 2 is likely going to make quite a chunk of change, and they won't have to share any of that. Into the Spider-Verse, while as an animated movie, turned a profit and it won an Oscar. It's got an amazing word of mouth I think because it was animated, it just didn't catch a lot of interest from the public going in. But I think word of mouth will have anything Spider-Verse related in the future bolstered an increase in this. And I think thanks to the MCU that they gave Sony some very thick training wheels to get Spider-Man in the right direction, which they cite in their recent tweet that they thank Kevin for where he put them on this direction because they're continuing Tom Holland. They're not getting rid of Tom Holland. He's still signed on for 2 more solo films, and his contract is with Sony. Disney didn't hire Tom Holland. Disney didn't even want to cast Tom Holland. Sony cast Tom Holland and fought to have Tom Holland be their Spider-Man. That's another thing people aren't talking about. But that they aren't going to be rebooting Spider-Man. They are not going to be retconning anything they've established so far. Worst case scenario, they just won't be able to mention any of the MCU elements, which is just as easy as ignoring Uncle Ben in the current Home series. They just have to not mention it. And where Spider-Man is at the end of Far From Home, it's very easy to do that. The way the film ended in Far From Home was almost an allegorical representation of Spider-Man being cut from the MCU. Because the way that movie ends, he's on his own. He has to be on his own. The way that movie set things up. And when I left that movie, that actually had me questioning whether or not we're going to see Spider-Man for a while or at all in the MCU going forward because of what that film ended with. But at the end of the day, financials aside, both studios are very confident that they just no longer need each other. And I think that's not true for Disney, but I do think Sony, now that they've had Disney's help, is in a position and in a path and direction to where they don't need Disney anymore. I think with the creative team they currently have, and their plans that they currently have, and what their approach, at least recently, has shown, is that they might be able to just do this and go it alone and come out on top better for it. So that's another thing we're just going to have to wait and see. I just think that it's a little blown out of proportion that this blame doesn't go solid one way or another, but Disney needs to back down on that ridiculous offer, because if they're not going to buy Sony, they are threatening their livelihood. They are threatening jobs. They are threatening the existence of that studio. And there's already this problem with Disney being such a box office force that the majority of the movies that get all of this attention are drowning out is Disney. I love Disney. I grew up on Disney. I still love most of the movies they make. I am not on board for any of these live action movies they've been making. I think that's a ridiculous trend, and I think a lot of it's been very soulless. But I've always defended Disney up until this point. I think this was clearly a greed move and an unfair demand of another small studio that the mouse is trying to bully into giving them what they want. Other than Sony, what do we really have left? There's the only other big studio that comes to mind is Paramount. You got Universal, Warner Brothers, Paramount, Sony. That's 4. And then you have the mouse, which is just huge right now. And if they keep playing like this, they would either remove Sony from the fold, and then it becomes they have 25% of the complete film market if that comes into play. If they buy Sony, we're one step closer to Disney just being the only studio that makes movies anymore. It's honestly a little scary. It's a little weird, and I don't like it. And I think I'm going to close this out on a statement that actually came out recently, I think today, actually, from Stan Lee's daughter regarding this situation. She commented that Marvel and Disney seeking total control of my father's creations must be checked and balanced by others who, while still seeking to profit, have genuine respect for Stan Lee and his legacy. Whether it's Sony or someone else, the continued evolution of Stan's characters and his legacy deserves multiple points of view. And it comes down to one of the oldest business practices in play and concepts of business, and that is that competition breeds innovation. It inspires. It inspires creativity. It forces them to outdo one another. Competition moves things forward, and if there's just this complete complicity, and they just become complacent with being pushed around by this giant corporate entity, it's kind of creativity is a little dead. And we've kind of started to see that with Disney and their current trend of what they're outputting. It's just money, cashing on nostalgia, owning nostalgia. They've bought most people's childhood. They own Lucasfilms, they own Star Wars, they own Marvel. They are Disney, so they have all of their Disney things as well. And their commodity at this point is just nostalgia. Anyway, I think I've rambled on just enough for this. So sorry, guys. I want to know what you all think of the whole situation. I hope this kind of shedded some light on the whole situation. And yeah, that is it for now. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. And I will catch you guys in the next video. Take care, everybody.